2 weeks in the books here in the fantasy football season, and some head coaches are driving me crazy already. Nevertheless, we persevere. It is the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. Let's get you ready for Week 3. What's up, everybody? Every week here on the show, we get you ready to set your lineups with waiver wire options, streaming options among quarterbacks, defenses, and tight ends, and also stealthy starts. Guys you normally wouldn't start, but can help you in this particular week. Be sure to comment here below if you're watching on YouTube. Give us a like, subscribe to our YouTube page, let us know what you think of the show. We're starting off here with Pick 'em Up, the three options among waiver wire players who are owned in fewer than 50% of leagues. And this first one breaks my heart. It's Carlos Hyde of the Houston Texans. And it breaks my heart because Duke Johnson is the superior running back on this roster. Bill O'Brien traded a third-round pick to get him, but he doesn't seem to care. Carlos Hyde is the primary back through 2 weeks in the Texans offense. Through those 2 games, Hyde has 31 touches to just 19 for Duke Johnson. And despite my love for Duke Johnson, you have to adjust with new information. Carlos Hyde is the guy to own moving forward, and he's owned in less than half of leagues, which means you have to go out and pick him up after he had 175 yards through the first 2 weeks of the season, 5.6 yards per touch. Week 3, he gets the Chargers on the road, who have allowed 191 yards and 2 touchdowns to running backs this year. Our second waiver wire option is a guy who is a third string, actually a fourth string running back to start the year in the preseason, Raheem Mostert of the San Francisco 49ers. So many injuries on this depth chart for the Niners. Now Mostert moves up, and he was phenomenal in week number 2. Against the Bengals on the road, he had more than 150 total yards of offense. And if you look at the snaps between this backfield, Raheem Mostert played 47% of the snaps, Matt Breida just 29%. Now, part of that was because it was a huge blowout. Niners are up big, just letting the clock run out in the second half. But this is still a committee. It's what Kyle Shanahan wants in this backfield. And week 3, Mostert gets to play the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have allowed 360 total yards this season to running backs. Among wide receivers on the waiver wire, there's only 2 that stand out to me this week, and they play for the same team. DeMarcus Robinson of the Kansas City Chiefs and Mecole Hardman, also of the Chiefs. They play the Ravens this week, but Pat Mahomes is matchup proof. That's the key to these 2 pickups. With Tyreek Hill out, these 2 guys are viable options. Mahomes is just the rising tide that raises all boats. Robinson in week 2 against Oakland, 91% of snaps, 6 targets. He caught every one of those targets for 172 yards and 2 touchdowns at Oakland. You want shares of this Chiefs offense. You never know who's going to pop any given week. And the rookie Mecole Hardman, this is the second week in a row I'm mentioning him, and for good reason. Week 2 at the Raiders, also 6 targets, played more than 70% of snaps, finished with 4 catches for 61 yards and a touchdown, and that doesn't take into account a 72-yard second touchdown that was called back because of a holding penalty. He could have exploded. This entire Chiefs offense is viable in fantasy football. Let's move on to the stream team for week number 3, and we begin with streaming defenses, and pretty good rule of thumb for the rest of the season. Whoever the Miami Dolphins are playing, pick up that defense. Check out the Dallas Cowboys in week number 3 taking on the Dolphins. Miami in the first 2 weeks, they played the Patriots week 2, got shut out, allowed 7 sacks, 4 interceptions, and 2 touchdowns to the Patriots defense. The Ravens defense in week 1, 10 points allowed, 3 sacks, 2 interceptions, and a fumble recovery. The Dolphins suck, and they all-time suck. They're not even trying to win at this point. Odds makers in Vegas have told us as much to start the season. Another streaming defense for this week, a little under the radar, but overperforming in the early going. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they take on the Giants in week number 3. And the Bucs, 15.5 points allowed through 2 weeks. 4 sacks, 2 forced turnovers, and a defensive touchdown so far this year. And the Giants offense through 2 weeks, 4 turnovers committed, and they've only scored 15.5 points per game with Eli Manning at quarterback. Hashtag stream against Eli Manning. As long as he is the quarterback, the streaming defense will be a viable option facing the Giants. Moving on to streaming quarterbacks for week number 3. Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills, his rushing floor keeps him a viable option in week 3. He had a rushing touchdown in week 2. If you look at what he did in week 1, he had 16 fantasy points despite turning the ball over 4 times. And again in week 2, more than 22 fantasy points. He was the QB7 on the week, and he gets to face the Bengals. Their fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks this year, 19.6 average fantasy points allowed to Jimmy Garoppolo and Russell Wilson through 2 weeks. A season ago, the Bengals allowed the 3rd most points to the quarterback position. Second streaming option, Matthew Stafford of the Detroit Lions. And yes, Matt Patricia wants to slow this offense down, but I still think he's a viable option in week number 3. Check out his matchup. Stafford gets to take on the Philadelphia Eagles on the road. This should be a shootout. Stafford, week 1, had 27.6 fantasy points at Arizona. Week 2, just 15.1 fantasy points. You got to keep it in context. He was facing the Chargers, who are a pretty tough defense. The Eagles, though, fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks this year, more than 23 per game. And they faced Matt Ryan, but week 1, they also faced Case Keenum and let him have a really good and productive game. 18.6 to quarterbacks a year ago was what they allowed in fantasy points. Still think that's a viable option. Let's move on to streaming tight ends now for week number 3. And it's a wasteland out there. If you don't have one of the good options, it is really hard to find a good tight end. But there's one guy who's been dropped across more than half of leagues who I think is a good option for week 3. The Colts' Eric Ebron. He gets to take on the Atlanta Falcons. Devin Funchess is on IR for the Indianapolis Colts. He's the number 2 target now behind T.Y. Hilton. In week 1, he had a slight bobble that would have been a touchdown. That wiped that TD out. In week 2, he did score a touchdown. I think you can start him and try and find that end zone again in week number 3 if you're desperate for a tight end. If you're really desperate, maybe Tyler Eifert of the Cincinnati Bengals. He did score in week number 2. He did not score in week number 1, but he did have 5 targets, caught all 5 of them. He's a tough option. He's facing the Buffalo Bills on the road. The Bills have elite cornerback play, so maybe Andy Dalton looks more into the middle of the field for Tyler Eifert. And really what you need to be doing here is stashing the New York Jets' Christopher Herndon, who's going to be coming off a suspension in the next couple of weeks. He's probably the best option available on waivers for the rest of the season among tight ends. And one other name to look out for, he's owned in just a little bit more than 50% of leagues, but Greg Olsen is still out there in many leagues, has 18 targets through 2 weeks of the season. Lastly, before we wrap up the show, Stealthy starts for week number 3. Guys that you typically wouldn't start on a given week, but given their matchup, are very viable options in your starting lineup moving forward. The first is Frank Gore of the Buffalo Bills taking on the Bengals. And originally I had Devin Singletary in this spot, but he left week 2 with a hamstring injury. We're going to have to monitor his status moving on for week number 3. In relief, Gore had 21 touches for the Buffalo Bills in week 2 and taking on the Bengals, the 3rd most fantasy points allowed to running backs in 2018. And this is just incredible. In 2019, the Bengals have allowed 426 total yards and 5 touchdowns to running backs in just the first 2 weeks of the season. Start Frank Gore and have confidence in it if Devin Singletary is out. The next option is another running back, and you kind of have to just grind your teeth and just go with it. It's a bad matchup, but it's about usage, and it's Chris Thompson of the Washington Redskins. They're taking on the Chicago Bears. This should be negative game script, which means they're going to be throwing, coming from behind. That, to me, favors Chris Thompson over Adrian Peterson. Thompson has 12 receptions through 2 weeks of the season. Coincidentally, that's the amount of receptions the Bears have allowed to running backs through the first 2 weeks of the year. In P.P.R. leagues only, Chris Thompson is a stealthy start for week number 3. Lastly, the Arizona wide receivers, and I say a couple of them, Larry Fitzgerald and Christian Kirk, because they're both viable stealthy starts. And it's because this air raid offense of Cliff Kingsbury has not disappointed whatsoever. Kyler Murray, their quarterback, through 2 weeks of the season, has 94 pass attempts. There are plenty of targets to go around, and Kirk and Fitz, of those 94 pass attempts, 44 of them have gone to Kirk and Fitzgerald. Both of them had double-digit targets in week number 2 against Baltimore. Now they get to take on the Carolina Panthers, and this is a pass-happy offense that can support multiple wide receivers. They both popped in week number 2, and I think they will continue to be productive as long as they continue to have this many pass attempts, which is what Cliff Kingsbury wants to do. Thank you so much for joining us this week on the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. My name is Steven Andress. Best of luck in week 3 and the rest of the season.